Imagine turning on your PC one morning, clicking through the familiar startup routine, and realizing that something fundamental has changed. The desktop looks like Windows, the logo is still there, the start menu still opens, but beneath the surface, the operating system you have relied on for decades is no longer truly Windows as you knew it. Instead, it is powered by Linux. Not in a virtual machine, not as a dual boot, not as a subsystem hidden away for developers, but as a first-class mode, officially supported, deeply integrated, and openly acknowledged by Microsoft itself. This is the idea behind Microsoft's rumored and increasingly plausible Linux mode. And if it becomes reality, it could mark the beginning of the end for Windows as a standalone operating system. Not the end of Microsoft, not the end of the Windows brand perhaps, but the end of Windows as an independent kernel, philosophy, and platform. To understand why this shift could finally kill Windows forever, we need to look at how Microsoft got here, what Linux mode actually represents, and why it might be the most logical, profitable, and inevitable move Microsoft has ever made. For most of its history, Microsoft defined itself in opposition to Linux. Windows was proprietary, closed source, and tightly controlled. Linux was open, community-driven, and fiercely independent. The two ecosystems represented different philosophies about software, ownership, and control. For years, Microsoft executives openly mocked Linux, calling it a cancer and dismissing it as a hobbyist toy. Yet, quietly and steadily, Linux began winning battles that Windows could not. Servers migrated to Linux because it was stable, scalable, and free from licensing headaches. Supercomputers standardized on Linux because it could be customized to extreme workloads. Cloud infrastructure gravitated toward Linux because it was efficient, transparent, and flexible. Developers embraced Linux because it aligned with open source tools, modern workflows, and containerized applications. Windows, once the unquestioned king of computing, started losing relevance in the very areas that defined the future of technology. Microsoft noticed, and instead of fighting Linux forever, it adapted. The first sign was subtle. Microsoft started contributing to the Linux kernel, not as a token gesture, but as a serious participant. Then came Azure, Microsoft's cloud platform, which runs predominantly on Linux. In fact, Linux workloads on Azure now outnumber Windows workloads, a fact that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Microsoft didn't just tolerate Linux in the cloud, it embraced it because customers demanded it. Developers wanted Linux environments, containers, and open source tools. Microsoft could either provide them or lose business to competitors. Pragmatism won over ideology. The next step was Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL. At first, it seemed like a clever compatibility layer, a way for developers to run Linux tools on Windows without rebooting. But WSL was more than convenience. It was a strategic experiment. Microsoft was testing how deeply Linux could be integrated into the Windows experience without users noticing or resisting. With WSL2, Microsoft went even further, running a real Linux kernel inside Windows, managed seamlessly and invisibly. Performance improved, compatibility increased, and suddenly Windows became one of the best platforms for Linux development. This was not an accident. It was a rehearsal. Now imagine that rehearsal becoming the main performance. Linux mode would not simply be WSL turned on by default. It would represent a shift where Windows becomes a shell, a user interface layer, and a compatibility environment running on top of a Linux kernel. From the user's perspective, nothing dramatic changes. Your apps still work, your games still launch, your files are still there, but underneath, the core of the system is Linux. This approach solves multiple problems Microsoft has struggled with for years, and that is why it could finally kill Windows as we know it. One of Windows' biggest burdens is its legacy. Decades of backward compatibility mean that Windows carries enormous technical debt. Ancient APIs, old drivers, outdated assumptions about hardware, and security models designed for a different era all weigh it down. Microsoft cannot simply throw these away without breaking millions of applications and alienating enterprise customers. Linux, by contrast, has managed its evolution more gracefully. It maintains compatibility at the kernel level while allowing user space components to evolve rapidly. By adopting a Linux kernel, Microsoft can offload much of the low-level hardware management, scheduling, memory handling, and driver support to a system that is already optimized for modern hardware. Security is another crucial factor. Windows has historically been the primary target for malware, ransomware, and exploits, partly because of its dominance on the desktop and partly because of architectural decisions made long ago. Microsoft has invested heavily in security features, but patching over a complex, aging foundation has limits. Linux's permission model, modular design, and open source transparency offer a different security posture. Vulnerabilities are often discovered and patched quickly by a global community. By shifting to Linux mode, Microsoft can inherit these advantages, while still layering its own security and management tools on top. For enterprises, this could mean fewer breaches, simpler audits, and better compliance. Performance and efficiency also play a role. Linux is renowned for running well on everything, from tiny embedded devices to massive servers. It scales efficiently and wastes fewer resources. As hardware trends shift toward heterogeneous architectures, ARM processors, and energy-efficient designs, Linux adapts quickly. Windows, while improving, often lags behind in optimal support for new architectures. A Linux-based Windows could adapt faster, run cooler, and perform better, especially on laptops and tablets where battery life matters. But perhaps the most important reason Linux mode could kill Windows is economic. Maintaining a proprietary kernel is expensive. It requires a massive engineering effort, constant testing, and endless compatibility work. Linux already does much of this heavy lifting, funded and improved by countless companies and contributors worldwide. By leveraging Linux, Microsoft can reduce internal costs while benefiting from external innovation. This is not surrender. It is outsourcing the plumbing while focusing on what Microsoft does best: platforms, services, and ecosystems. Microsoft today is not the same company it was in the 1990s. Its revenue no longer depends primarily on Windows licenses. Instead, it comes from cloud services, subscriptions, enterprise tools, and software as a service offerings. Microsoft 365, Azure, Teams, and developer services generate recurring income regardless of the underlying operating system. In this context, Windows becomes a means to an end, not the end itself. If Linux mode helps keep users within Microsoft's ecosystem while reducing costs and increasing flexibility, it is a rational business move. There is also the developer angle. Developers increasingly prefer Linux-based environments because they align with modern tool chains, containerization, and deployment pipelines. Docker, Kubernetes, and most CI/CD systems are Linux. While Windows has made strides, it often feels like a second-class citizen in these work. Linux mode would eliminate that friction entirely. Developers could run native Linux tools without emulation, while still having access to Windows-only applications when needed. This hybrid environment could make Microsoft's platform the default choice for development, ironically by embracing Linux rather than resisting it. Gaming, often cited as Windows' last stronghold, is no longer immune to change. Linux gaming has improved dramatically thanks to projects like Proton and Vulkan, allowing many Windows games to run on Linux with little or no performance loss. If Microsoft controls the Linux-based platform, it can ensure top-tier gaming support while reducing reliance on legacy Windows components. DirectX could be translated or re-implemented more efficiently on Linux, or Microsoft could push cross-platform APIs that work seamlessly across systems. The idea that games require real Windows is already weakening, and Linux mode would accelerate that trend. From the user's perspective, Linux mode could be presented as a choice, at least initially. During installation or updates, users might be offered a performance-focused Linux mode or a compatibility-focused classic mode. Over time, as Linux mode matures and proves stable, it could become the default. Classic Windows would remain as a fallback, then as an optional download, and eventually as a legacy product supported only for specific enterprise needs. This gradual transition avoids backlash while steering the ecosystem in a new direction. Critics might argue that this would alienate traditional Windows users or confuse the market, but history suggests otherwise. Most users do not care about kernels or operating system internals. They care about whether their apps work, their files are safe, and their system is fast and reliable. If Linux mode delivers a better experience, users will accept it even if they never realize what changed. In fact, many users already unknowingly rely on Linux every day through Android phones, smart TVs, routers, and cloud services. The stigma of Linux as a niche or a difficult system has largely disappeared outside of certain desktop perceptions. Another important factor is regulation and openness. Governments and institutions increasingly demand transparency, security audits, and open standards. Proprietary systems face growing scrutiny. By basing its platform on Linux, Microsoft can argue that its foundation is open, auditable, and aligned with global standards, even if the upper layers remain proprietary. This could ease adoption in sensitive sectors like government, education, and infrastructure, where Windows sometimes faces resistance. There's also a psychological dimension to consider. For decades, Windows defined personal computing. To admit that Windows is no longer the core of Microsoft's strategy is to admit that an era is ending. But Microsoft has already made this admission indirectly. The company now describes itself as a cloud-first, AI-first organization. Operating systems are platforms for services, not identities. Linux mode would be the final step in this transformation, acknowledging that the kernel war is over and that Linux has won on technical and strategic grounds. If Windows dies in this scenario, it does not die in a dramatic explosion. It fades into abstraction. The Windows name may survive as a user interface, a compatibility layer, or a brand, but the Windows kernel, the NT architecture that powered generations of PCs, would quietly step aside. In its place, Linux would run the show, invisible to most, but essential to everything. Ironically, this outcome would fulfill Linux advocates' dreams and Microsoft's goals simultaneously. Linux would finally dominate the desktop, not by replacing Windows outright, but by becoming Windows. Microsoft would retain control over its ecosystem, users, and revenue streams while shedding the burdens of maintaining a proprietary kernel. Developers would get a unified, modern environment. Enterprises would gain flexibility and security. Users would get a faster, more efficient system without needing to relearn how to use their computers. So when people ask whether Microsoft's new Linux mode could finally kill Windows forever, the answer is not just yes, but that it might already be in the process of doing so, not out of failure, but out of evolution. Windows would not be defeated by Linux in a dramatic battle. It would merge with it, dissolve into it, and reemerge as something new. And in that quiet transformation, one of the most iconic operating systems in history would effectively end not with a crash, but with an update.